The lot behind the apartment building was a place where nothing grew. It was a stretch of gray, sun-baked earth that smelled of dust and old heat. Pilar stood at the very edge of the property, her boots sinking slightly into the parched, unyielding surface. She held a wilted seed packet between her thumb and forefinger, the paper thin and brittle. She traced the rough texture of the packet, feeling the faint, faded outlines of flowers that had no business existing in a place like this. She looked down at the ground. It was a graveyard of cracked concrete and dry, compacted clay. She shifted her weight, pressing the heel of her boot into the soil, but the earth did not yield. It was as hard as stone, baked solid by months of relentless sun. She looked back at the seed packet, then out across the expanse of the lot. The silence of the alley was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of traffic that never seemed to reach this corner. She took a breath, the air tasting of grit and dry heat. Instead, she stepped forward, her eyes fixed on a patch of ground that looked just as dead as the rest. She was not looking for a place that was ready. She was looking for a place to begin. The lot was a landscape of industrial decay. Jagged shards of rusted iron jutted from the surface like broken teeth, remnants of a structure long since demolished. Beneath the layer of fine, gray dust, the ground was a patchwork of cracked concrete slabs, shifted and tilted by years of neglect. There was no soft soil here, only a dense, compacted crust that resisted the slightest pressure. A discarded pipe lay half buried in the center, its surface flaking away in orange scales. Further back, a pile of shattered bricks formed a miniature mountain, blocking the path of any potential drainage. The sun beat down on these materials, turning the metal hot to the touch and baking the concrete until it shimmered with trapped heat. Every inch of the space felt hostile to life. The wind whipped through the alley, carrying grit that rattled against the debris, creating a harsh metallic chorus. It was a graveyard of human refuse, a place where the earth had been smothered under layers of debris. Pilar scanned the perimeter, noting where the concrete was thickest. The environment offered no invitation, no soft spot, and no mercy. It was a challenge etched in stone and steel, waiting for someone to try and break it. Pilar moved to the center of the lot, stepping over a rusted coil of wire. She found a patch of ground where the concrete was less dense, though the earth remained as dry as ash. She lowered herself slowly, bending her knees until they pressed into the grit. She did not rush. She placed her palms flat against the surface, feeling the heat radiating upward through her skin. The ground was stubborn, a hard, compacted crust that offered no give. She pushed down with the weight of her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a second, focusing on the sensation of the dust against her skin, the fine particles settling into the lines of her palms. She felt the lack of moisture, the total absence of life in the dirt beneath her. It was a dead, hollow foundation. She stared at the spot where her hands rested, her fingers splayed wide. She knew what lay beneath the surface, and she was ready to break it. Pilar gripped the handle of the trowel, her knuckles whitening as she drove the steel blade into the packed earth. The metal sank only an inch before it hit something solid. A sharp, high-pitched screech echoed through the alley as the trowel skidded against a buried stone. She adjusted her grip, shifted her weight, and drove the blade down again, harder this time. The ground refused to yield, vibrating up through her arm with every impact. She wedged the tip of the tool under the edge of the obstruction, using the leverage of her entire body to pry it loose. The stone was larger than she anticipated, wedged deep into the clay. She pulled back, her muscles straining, and the rock finally shifted with a dull, grinding thud. As she reached down to heave the jagged piece of concrete from the hole, the sharp edge sliced across her hand. A thin line of red appeared across her knuckles, blooming quickly against the gray dust. She did not flinch or pull away. She gripped the stone tighter, ignoring the sting, and tossed it aside with a heavy thud. She looked at the raw scrape, wiped the blood against the side of her leg, and immediately positioned the trowel for the next strike. The ground had drawn blood, but the hole was open. Pilar did not pause to bandage the scrape. She drove the trowel into the earth again, the metal biting deeper into the stubborn clay. Each thrust was a measured, deliberate strike. She cleared a second hole, then a third, the rhythm of the work taking over her movements. The soil was dense, clinging to the blade like wet cement. She used her fingers to break apart the larger clods, pressing her palms into the cool, damp interior. With every handful she turned, the dark clay coated her skin, filling the creases of her knuckles and staining her fingertips a deep, permanent black. She worked in silence, her breathing steady and synchronized with the scrape of metal against stone. She ignored the ache spreading through her wrists. She dug until the pile of excavated dirt grew into a small mound beside her knees. Her hands were no longer clean, but they were functional. She reached into the hole, pulling out another layer of debris, her movements becoming faster, more fluid. The gray dust was vanishing. She wiped a streak of clay across her forehead, leaving a dark smudge, and continued to dig, her focus narrowing until there was nothing left. The rhythmic scrape of the trowel was the only sound in the alley until a sharp voice cut through the air. Mrs. Higgins leaned over the iron railing of her balcony, her gaze fixed on the mess of dirt and debris. "You are wasting your time, girl," she shouted, her voice thin and biting. "That ground has been dead for 20 years. Pilar did not look up. She did not even blink. She pressed her palms deeper into the cooling clay. The words from above were just noise, a distraction that held no weight compared to the density of the soil beneath her. Pilar simply reached out, picked up a jagged piece of metal, and tossed it into a pile. She focused on the smell of the damp earth. She simply dug, her movements steady and unbothered, until the voice from the balcony finally faded. The alley returned to its quiet, heavy stillness, and Pilar went back to the work. Pilar reached for the plastic bucket sitting at the edge of the concrete. It was heavy, filled with the remnants of the week: potato peels, wilted lettuce, and crushed eggshells. She dragged it to the center of the lot, the plastic scraping against the grit. She knelt, her knees sinking into the dirt she had already loosened. She tipped the bucket, spilling the damp, decaying matter onto the gray surface. The smell of wet earth and organic rot rose instantly, a sharp contrast to the stale, dry air. She did not hesitate. She plunged her hands into the heap, grabbing handfuls of the scraps and pressing them deep into the soil. She worked the material in, her fingers acting as a rake, tearing through the mixture until the scraps were buried beneath the surface. She grabbed a handful of the dry, packed earth and squeezed it together with the wet organic matter, feeling the resistance of the clay yield. She repeated this, moving in a circle, turning the ground over and over. Her forearms burned with the effort, but she kept the pace steady. The process was messy, coating her arms in a thick, dark paste, but she ignored the grime. She was feeding the ground, replacing the dust with life. The transformation did not happen in a single day. It was a slow, grinding process of turning the earth under the relentless sun. Pilar maintained the cycle, day after day, her movements becoming a rhythm she could perform with her eyes closed. She would arrive at dawn, when the air was still cool, and begin the work of breaking the surface. At first, the ground resisted, the gray dust packing tight against her spade. But as she folded the organic matter deeper into the clay, the resistance began to soften. She noticed the change in the sound of her tools. The sharp, metallic screech of the trowel hitting buried stone grew infrequent, then stopped entirely. She pulled the last jagged piece of concrete from the center of the lot and set it aside. Now, when she plunged her hands into the ground, the earth gave way with a heavy, damp weight. She lifted a handful and let it fall, watching as the gray, lifeless powder crumbled into rich, dark loam. It was no longer a graveyard of debris. It was a living, breathing bed of soil. She wiped her forehead, leaving a smudge of dark clay across her skin, and looked out over the expanse. The transformation was complete. The ground was ready, holding the moisture and the nutrients she had spent weeks feeding into it. She stood up, her joints stiff from the hours of kneeling, and finally allowed herself a moment to breathe as the sun reached its peak. Pilar knelt at the edge of the plot, her eyes scanning the dark, crumbly surface. The morning air was still, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. She leaned closer, her breath hitching as she spotted a tiny, jagged fissure in the loam. She held her hand steady, a few inches above the ground, waiting for a sign. A minute passed, in total silence. Then, a small, pale green loop pushed through the surface, trembling against the weight of a single grain of dirt. Pilar did not touch it. She watched as the sprout straightened, shedding the soil like a heavy coat. It was barely the size of a fingernail, but it stood firm against the morning breeze. She shifted her gaze, scanning the surrounding area, and saw another, then a third. They were scattered across the dark patch, tiny green needles piercing the gray monotony. She sat back on her heels, her hands resting on her thighs, and watched the sunlight hit the fragile leaves. They were translucent, glowing with a soft, vibrant intensity. She stood up, careful not to disturb the soil, and stepped back to give them room to grow. The growth of the garden demanded a price paid in sweat and aching joints. Every morning, Pilar returned to the lot to maintain the delicate balance she had created. She moved between the rows, her hands working the soil to keep it aerated and free of debris. The repetition was relentless. Her shoulders burned with every reach, and her lower back tightened into a knot that refused to loosen. She paused, leaning heavily on her spade, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her hands were raw, the skin split and calloused from the constant friction of the tools. She looked down at her legs. They trembled. Beneath her, protesting the hours spent kneeling in the dirt, a sharp cramp flared in her calf, forcing her to drop the trowel and grip her leg until the muscle finally gave way. The garden was thriving, the green leaves thickening and reaching toward the light, but the effort to sustain them was pushing her to her physical limit. She reached down, retrieved the spade, and drove it into the loam. By mid-July, the garden had reached a state of lush, unchecked vitality. The leaves were broad and deep green, casting long, cool shadows across the dark loam. Pilar moved through the rows, checking the stems, but the rhythm of the work began to change. The air grew thick, losing its morning crispness. By noon, the wind had died completely, leaving the alley trapped in a stagnant, suffocating stillness. Pilar wiped her brow, but the sweat did not evaporate. It clung to her skin like a second layer. She stood upright, listening. The usual chirping of sparrows in the nearby eaves had vanished. The silence was absolute, heavy with the weight of the rising temperature. She looked up at the sky, which had bleached to a pale, blinding white. The sun was no longer a source of growth, but a hammer beating down on the lot. She reached out to touch a leaf, but pulled her hand back. The surface was hot to the touch, radiating a dry, intense energy. The plants seemed to sense the shift, their leaves losing their supple, upright posture. The easy, rapid expansion of the previous weeks ground to a halt. The heatwave arrived with a physical force that turned the alley into a kiln. Pilar reached for the communal tap at the edge of the lot, her hand already anticipating the cool spray of water. She gripped the metal handle and twisted, but it did not budge. She braced her feet against the cracked concrete, pulled with both hands, and felt the iron bite into her palms. It was locked. A heavy padlock hung from the valve, glinting in the harsh, white light. She shook the pipe, but the metal remained cold and unresponsive. Panic flickered in her chest, but she pushed it down, turning her attention to the rows of plants. The transformation was already underway. The broad, vibrant leaves that had stood tall only hours before were beginning to curl at the edges. A sunflower stalk bowed its head, the heavy blooms sagging toward the parched earth. Pilar knelt beside it, pressing her fingers into the soil. The moisture had vanished, leaving the ground cracked and unresponsive. The life she had built was fracturing, hour by hour, under the weight of the drought. Pilar stood over the wilting rows, watching the leaves lose their last trace of resilience. She looked at the locked tap, then back at the sagging stalks. Waiting for the city to return was not an option. She turned away, walked to the back of the apartment building, and found a heavy, discarded plastic bin. She dragged it across the gravel, the plastic screeching against the grit. Her shoulders burned with the effort, but she did not stop. She hauled the bin to the edge of the sidewalk, positioning it where the sun-drenched street met the shadow of the building. She pulled a piece of cardboard from a pile of refuse and a thick marker from her pocket. She pressed the tip into the cardboard, the ink bleeding into the fibers as she wrote, "Water for the soil," in jagged block letters. She taped the sign to the front of the bin. She stood back, checking the angle. It was visible from the street. She stood by the bin, waiting for the first passerby to notice the plea. The bin remained empty. Pilar watched the street for 10 minutes, but the heat kept the neighborhood indoors. She could not wait for the water to come to her. She turned toward the apartment building and stepped into the dim, cool stairwell. Her boots clicked against the concrete as she climbed to the first floor. She stopped at the first door and knocked. A man opened it, his face obscured by the shadows. Pilar did not wait for him to speak. She pointed toward the window. She asked for anything, half-filled glass, a rinsing basin, anything that would have gone down the drain. He hesitated, then slowly nodded. She moved to the next door. She knocked with a rhythmic, insistent force. When a woman answered, Pilar repeated her request. She moved from floor to floor, her face set in a mask of grim determination. Some residents closed their doors, but she did not linger. She climbed higher, the air growing stale and hot. But she did not slow her pace. She was not leaving until she had enough. Pilar moved back down the hallway, her arms now heavy with the first of the contributions. She held a mismatched collection of vessels, a chipped ceramic mug, a plastic rinsing basin, and a glass pitcher still slick with condensation. She moved with deliberate, measured steps, keeping her elbows tucked against her ribs to stabilize the load. At each door that had opened, she stopped to collect the promised water. She poured the contents of a half-empty glass into her primary bucket, the liquid splashing against the bottom with a hollow, metallic ring. She accepted a basin of cloudy pasta water from a neighbor, her fingers brushing the warm, starchy surface. She did not waste a drop. Every vessel was tilted at a precise angle, ensuring the last remnants of moisture drained into her collection. She navigated the narrow, dimly lit corridor, her eyes fixed on the shifting surface of the water in her bucket. She paused to adjust her grip on a heavy glass jar, her knuckles white from the strain. The air in the hallway was thick and stagnant, but she ignored the heat, focusing entirely on the rhythmic slosh of the water. She gathered the final basin. Pilar pushed through the heavy lobby door and stepped out into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The buckets were dead weight, pulling her shoulders down toward the cracked pavement. She took a step, then another, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that burned in her chest. The plastic handles bit into her palms, leaving deep, white indentations that throbbed with every movement. She kept her gaze fixed on the dirt lot ahead, ignoring the sweat that stung her eyes. Halfway across the lot, her left boot caught on a jagged piece of exposed rebar. She lurched forward, the bucket swinging violently. She slammed her feet wide, bracing her core, and forced her body to remain upright. Her shoulders screamed in protest. She reached the first row of drooping stalks, her lungs heaving, and finally lowered the weight to the dry, thirsty ground. Pilar knelt, the dry earth pressing into her knees. She did not pour from the heavy bucket directly. Instead, she picked up a small, rusted tin cup. She dipped it into the bucket, catching the murky water with a steady hand. She leaned over the first sprout, tilting the tin just enough to create a thin, controlled stream. The water hit the base of the stalk, disappearing instantly into the parched, cracked soil. She watched the ground darken, waiting for the moisture to sink deep before moving to the next. She repeated this motion with rhythmic, agonizing slowness. She accounted for every plant, gauging the size of each stalk and adjusting the volume of water accordingly. When a bead of liquid threatened to run off the edge of the depression she had carved, she quickly used her finger to redirect the flow toward the roots. Her hands were steady, despite the lingering tremors from the walk. She did not allow a single drop to evaporate on the surface or soak into the surrounding dust. She moved down the row, kneeling, pouring, and checking the absorption rate. The bucket grew lighter, the water level dropping with each measured scoop. By the time the last of the water was gone, the soil around every plant was damp and dark, a stark contrast to the surrounding gray expanse. The days blurred into a cycle of heat and labor. Pilar returned to the lot each morning before the sun could bake the earth into a hard crust. She spent hours clearing debris, her trowel scraping against stones, her fingers working the soil into a fine, crumbly texture. She watched the stalks closely. They were thin, fragile things, trembling in the hot wind, but they held their position. Then, the change began. It started as a faint tension in the center of the stems. Pilar knelt in the dirt, her eyes fixed on the highest node. She heard nothing, yet the plant seemed to pulse with effort. A tiny, tightly wound knot of green tissue began to swell. The knot split. A sliver of bright, vibrant green pushed through the protective casing. It was slow, agonizingly deliberate, but it did not stop. The leaf unfolded like a fan, stretching outward to catch the morning light. It was followed by another, then a third. The color was sharp. Pilar leaned forward, her fingertips brushing the edge of the new growth. She stood up, her joints stiff, and looked across the rows. The sky turned a bruised, heavy purple by mid-afternoon. The air grew thick, pressing against the window pane with a sudden, unnatural weight. Pilar stood in her kitchen, watching the leaves of her sunflowers shudder. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the alley, vibrating the floorboards beneath her feet. Then the first gust hit. It was not a breeze, but a physical force that slammed into the lot. The stalks bowed low, their heavy heads fighting the pressure. But the wind shifted direction with a violent, erratic snap. Pilar gripped the window frame, her knuckles white. Another blast tore through the narrow space between the buildings. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the glass as the first stalk gave way. It did not bend. It splintered, the wooden fibers snapping like matchsticks. A second stalk followed, then a third, collapsing into the churned earth. The wind howled, a high, piercing whistle that drowned out all other sound. Pilar watched as the rows she had nurtured for weeks were flattened. She could only watch as the storm systematically dismantled the garden. The wind died as the first gray light of dawn bled over the rooftops. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water. Pilar pushed the back door open. The air smelled of wet earth and bruised vegetation. She stepped off the concrete threshold, and her boots sank instantly into the mire. The lot was unrecognizable. Where there had been rows of vibrant green, there was now a sprawling, tangled graveyard of splintered wood and shredded leaves. The mud clung to her ankles, thick and cold, pulling at her with every step she took toward the center of the wreckage. She looked down at the ground. A heavy stalk lay across her path, its fibers frayed, the sap weeping into the dark slush. The sunflowers were gone, their heads pressed deep into the muck. Their once sturdy stems snapped at erratic angles. She stood motionless, the weight of the destruction pressing in from all sides, watching the gray light settle over the ruins of her work. Pilar knelt, the mud soaked through her knees, cold and gritty, but she did not pull away. She reached for the thickest, most mangled stalk. Its fibers splayed wide like a broken fan. She gripped the stem, her fingers finding purchase in the slick, wet wood, and heaved it aside. It was heavy, laden with the weight of the storm-soaked leaves. She tossed it onto a pile of debris and reached for the next. Her hands moved with a frantic, searching energy, pushing aside the wreckage of the giants that had once stood tall. She cleared a patch of ground, her palms scraping against the sharp edges of broken wood. She found only more mud, more ruin. A wave of exhaustion threatened to pull her down, but she shifted her weight and pushed deeper into the center of the lot. She moved a final, massive cluster of leaves. Beneath the canopy of the fallen, a small, vibrant green shoot remained untouched. She touched the stem, feeling the hidden strength of the plant. She wiped the mud from her face, her eyes fixed on the green, and the tension in her shoulders finally broke. She stood up, her joints protesting the damp chill. The garden needed more than just clearing. It needed support. She scanned the alleyway, her eyes darting toward the overflowing trash bins behind the building. She scrambled toward them, digging through discarded cardboard until her fingers closed around a bundle of coarse, industrial twine. Nearby, she found a collection of discarded broom handles, their bristles worn to nubs, the wood splintered but solid. She hauled the materials back to the mud-slicked center of the lot. She knelt again, her hands moving with a new, sharp urgency. She took a broom handle and drove it deep into the soft, saturated earth, twisting it until it held firm against the resistance of the clay. She reached for a bent sunflower, its head drooping toward the muck, and carefully lifted the stalk. She pressed it against the wood, her fingers trembling slightly. She wound the twine around the stem and the handle, pulling the knot tight until the plant stood straight. The twine bit into her skin, but she did not stop. The sun crested the apartment buildings, casting long, sharp shadows across the lot. The mud, once loose and yielding, began to bake under the morning heat, turning into a stubborn, heavy paste. Pilar did not slow. Her hands moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that ignored the ache in her wrists. She cleared the last of the snapped twigs and shredded leaves, tossing them into a neat pile at the edge of the lot. With each sweep of her arm, the chaos of the storm vanished. She moved from one stalk to the next, her fingers tying knots with practiced, fluid motions. She drove the final broom handle into the earth, the wood sinking with a dull thud, and braced the last leaning sunflower. She stepped back, wiping her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dark soil across her skin. The garden was no longer a graveyard of broken wood. It was a grid of upright, tethered life. She knelt one last time to pack the earth firmly around the base of the stakes, her palms pressing down until the ground felt solid. The debris was gone. The stalks stood in straight, defiant rows. She stood up, her legs stiff, and looked out over the lot. The air was still, and the garden held its breath. Weeks passed, and the garden began to claim the space with aggressive, vibrant life. The heat of August intensified, but the soil held the moisture deep within its dark, crumbly layers. The stalks, once braced by twine and wood, thickened and hardened, turning from green to a deep, fibrous brown. Each morning, the lot seemed to stretch upward, the leaves unfurling into broad emerald fans that caught the sun. By mid-August, the transformation was absolute. The sunflowers surged toward the sky, topping out at 10 feet, their massive heads heavy with ripening seeds. They stood in a dense, golden phalanx that blocked out the gray concrete. When the wind moved through the alley, it no longer snapped the stalks. It rippled through them. The entire lot became a sea of gold. The garden had reached its peak, standing tall and immovable against the backdrop of the city. The change in the lot did not go unnoticed for long. For months, the alley had been a place to pass through, a gray shortcut avoided by those living above. Now, the golden canopy cast a cool, inviting shadow that reached across the pavement. It started with a single folding chair, dragged through the back door by a neighbor. They set it down in the center of the stalks, surrounded by the towering sunflowers, and sat. Soon, a second chair appeared, then a third. The sound of clinking porcelain replaced the harsh echoes of the city. Neighbors who had once walked past with their heads down now stopped to navigate the narrow paths. They carried thermoses of tea and small plates of food, settling into the shade to escape the late afternoon heat. The space became a quiet living room under the open sky. Conversations drifted through the golden stalks, low and steady. People who had lived in the same building for years without exchanging more than a nod now sat together. The lot was no longer an abandoned patch of dirt. It had become a shared sanctuary, a place where the community gathered to rest, talk, and exist within the shade. The lot was no longer an abandoned patch of dirt. It had become a shared sanctuary, a place where the community gathered to rest, talk, and exist within the shade. The Harvest Festival transformed the garden into the center of the neighborhood. String lights were woven between the heavy stalks, casting a warm, flickering glow over the faces of the people gathered beneath the golden canopy. The air was thick with the scent of tea. As the sun dipped below the apartment rooftops, the crowd parted. The mayor stepped into the center of the clearing, moving past the thick, fibrous stems that had once been nothing more than broken twigs. The chatter died down, replaced by the rustle of leaves. The mayor stopped in front of Pilar. There was no grand speech, only a brief, deliberate movement. The mayor reached forward and pinned a ribbon to the fabric of her shirt, a small, bright splash of color against the backdrop of the garden. It was a formal acknowledgement of the months spent in the dirt. A ripple of applause broke out, growing louder as it echoed off the concrete walls of the alley. People leaned in, their faces illuminated by the lights. For a moment, the entire neighborhood stood still, united by the sight of the garden that had risen from the gray dust. The work was no longer hers alone. The applause continued to ripple through the alley, but the sound seemed to drift away from the center of the garden. Pilar did not look at the cameras or the faces pressed close to the stalks. She looked down. The ground, once a graveyard of rusted metal and cracked concrete, was now soft and yielding under her feet. She knelt, the fabric of her pants dampening against the dark, crumbly loam. She ignored the mayor, the ribbon, and the expectant silence of the neighbors. Her focus narrowed to the patch of earth directly between her knees. She pressed her palm into the surface, feeling the cool, dense weight of the soil she had spent months turning, watering, and protecting. She closed her fingers, scooping up a thick, dark handful. As she lifted her hand, she slowly opened her fist. The earth began to slide, grain by grain, sifting through her fingers like fine, dark sand. Pilar did not stand. She remained on the damp ground, her palms still resting against the surface of the loam. The crowd waited, expecting a speech, a thank you, or a nod to the mayor. Instead, she reached toward the base of the nearest sunflower. The stalk was thick, fibrous, and scarred from the storm, but it held firm. She brushed aside a layer of mulch, exposing the network of pale, tangled fibers that gripped the earth. She pointed to the roots. They were woven deep into the soil, wrapping around the stones. And the remnants of the old concrete, anchoring the plant against the weight of the world. She traced the path of a single root with her index finger, showing how it pulled strength from the dark, rich clay. The silence in the alley deepened. The neighbors looked from the towering sunflowers to the ground, beneath their own feet. They saw the connection now. The garden was not just the gold petals or the shade. It was the hidden, persistent labor that held the ground together. Pilar stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her legs, leaving streaks of dark earth behind. She did not look for applause. She looked at the roots, then at the people, and finally at the lot. The work was finished, but the foundation remained. The garden was a testament to holding on.